The cold, unforgiving city streets pulse with silence until a worn woman, hidden in shadows, asks for help. But what if the woman begging for food is hiding a dark, shocking secret? She's not just any homeless soul. She's the wife of a billionaire, and her past might just destroy everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. Eleanor sat on the cold corner of the city's busiest intersection, her back pressed against the brick wall of a rundown building. The noise of the city swirled around her, but it felt distant, muffled by the thick layer of isolation she had built around herself. She kept her head lowered, eyes hidden beneath a mess of tangled hair, clutching a worn blanket that barely shielded her from the biting wind. The feeling of being invisible had become second nature. Her fingers gently traced the outline of the diamond ring she still wore, though it no longer sparkled the way it used to. It was a hollow piece of her past, a reminder of a life that was now gone. She couldn't bring herself to take it off. It felt like the last connection to the woman she used to be, to the life she had abandoned. The world around her moved on, rushing by without a second glance. People passed in a blur, heads down, eyes fixed on their phones, lost in their own worlds. A few drops bared change into the cup she held out in front of her, their expressions blank. No one cared enough to see the woman behind the rags and dirt. No one ever did. But then, there was the woman who paused. Eleanor felt at first a subtle shift in the air. A woman, not much older than herself, stopped in front of her, looking down with a look of hesitation. She was dressed warmly, her coat sharp and clean, contrasting sharply with Eleanor's ragged appearance. The woman was holding a paper bag, the kind that seemed too neat for this part of the city. "Excuse me, do you need something to eat?" The woman's voice was gentle, almost too kind. Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting to the woman's face, then quickly lowering again. She wasn't sure how to respond. Could someone like her, someone so far removed from the life she had once known, accept help? Was she even allowed to? The woman stood there, waiting, her brow furrowed with concern. It wasn't pity she saw in the stranger's eyes, it was genuine empathy. Eleanor finally nodded, her voice a whisper. "Thank you." The woman smiled softly, offering the bag. "I know it's not much, but it's something. Take care of yourself." Eleanor took the bag from her, her fingers brushing the woman's hand for a brief moment. She wanted to say something, anything. To tell her she wasn't just a homeless woman on the streets, that she used to have everything, that she had a life, a home, a husband. But the words never left her lips. Instead, she just nodded again, her throat tight. She opened the bag, revealing a sandwich and a small coffee cup. The woman hesitated, then asked, "Do you need anything else? A blanket? A coat?" Eleanor shook her head, not trusting her voice. The kindness in the woman's words stirred something deep within her. Something Eleanor had almost forgotten was still there. Hope. But she pushed it down, along with the surge of guilt that followed. It felt wrong to want more than what she already had. She was meant to be here, meant to suffer. "Thank you," she managed again, barely above a whisper. The woman looked at her for a moment longer, as if trying to make sense of the broken soul in front of her. Then, after a quiet pause, she turned and walked away. Eleanor watched her disappear into the crowd, the sounds of the city swallowing the moment whole. Eleanor glanced down at the sandwich in her hands, the edges of her fingers trembling slightly. She hadn't realized how hungry she was, how long it had been since anyone had treated her like more than just a statistic. A homeless woman begging for change. But there it was, the memory of a life she'd left behind, rising to the surface again. She'd been loved once. She had been someone's whole world. But that was before the crash. Before everything was ripped away from her in the blink of an eye. The sandwich tasted like more than food. It tasted like a fleeting moment of kindness, a reminder that she could still exist in the world. And for just a moment, she wasn't invisible. But Eleanor quickly crushed that thought. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve the kindness, the sympathy, or the chance to rebuild. She had lost it all, and she had chosen to let go. A part of her wondered if she could ever truly find a way back, or if she even wanted to. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took another bite of the sandwich, her mind drifting back to the life she had once known. The city's noise was no longer a dull hum to her. Instead, it was a constant reminder of everything she had abandoned. The cold breeze tugged at the edges of her blanket, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts had taken her far from the street corner, far from the reality of the world around her. She remembered a time when she would have never dreamed of being here. The clinking of crystal glasses at lavish parties, the soft hum of a piano in a grand, marble-floored mansion. She had been the queen of her world, married to Alexander Hargrave, a man whose wealth and influence reached every corner of the country. The finest clothes, the finest food, the finest everything, it had all been hers. But none of it mattered now. None of it had saved her from the grief that had swallowed her whole. Her husband's death had been sudden, a cruel twist of fate. A crash on a rainy evening, too sudden to process, too overwhelming to bear. The pain, the guilt, the anger, it all bled together into a single, sharp ache that tore through her chest. But what no one knew, what no one could ever know, was the truth behind her disappearance. It wasn't just the accident that had shattered her life. It was the choice she had made in its aftermath. She had run. Her mind raced as the images of her past flashed through her. The way Alexander had held her at night, their shared dreams, their love for one another. It seemed like another lifetime. In the immediate aftermath of his death, there had been sympathy, support, people offering their condolences, trying to wrap her in the warmth of their empathy. But it had only felt suffocating. So, she'd made the decision to leave. She hadn't wanted to be seen as the grieving widow anymore. She hadn't wanted to be trapped in the public's pity. So, she vanished. No one knew she was alive. Everyone thought she had died in the crash, just like her husband. It was easier that way. For a while, she had convinced herself it was the only way to escape. Her grip tightened on the sandwich, but the taste was gone now, replaced by the bitter edge of regret. Eleanor snapped out of her daze when she heard footsteps approach again. Her heart skipped a beat as a shadow fell over her. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. It was the woman, the one who had given her the food. The woman stood there, slightly hesitating, looking down at her once more. She held something else this time, a small, folded blanket in her arms. Her voice was soft but firm. "I couldn't help but notice you look cold. Would you like something to wrap around you?" Eleanor blinked, the words catching in her throat. The woman's kindness was almost too much. She hadn't asked for anything, hadn't expected anyone to give her anything beyond a few coins or a passing glance. But here this woman was, offering her warmth once again, something that went beyond a meal. For a moment, Eleanor thought about refusing. She wanted to keep her distance, remain locked in her silent, invisible prison. But something inside her urged her to say yes. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the sense of human connection that had been absent for so long. Maybe it was just the simple fact that she was tired of hiding, tired of pretending that she could handle everything on her own. With a quiet, hesitant nod, Eleanor spoke softly. "Thank you." The woman smiled, and for a brief second, their eyes met, Eleanor's gaze flickering with something close to gratitude. The woman reached down and draped the blanket over her shoulders, the warmth of it feeling almost foreign. As she did, Eleanor noticed something, a faint glimmer of recognition in the woman's eyes. Before Eleanor could say anything, the woman quickly stepped back, as if the moment had been too much. "Take care of yourself," she said softly, her voice tinged with both concern and finality. "You don't have to be invisible." And with that, she walked away, leaving Eleanor sitting there once again alone, but not quite the same. The words hung in the air. "You don't have to be invisible." For a fleeting moment, Eleanor felt like she could breathe, as if someone had seen her, truly seen her. The simple act of kindness had cracked open something within her, a reminder of the life she had buried deep inside, a life she thought she had no right to return to. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, the warmth spreading through her chest. She didn't know what to do with the emotions churning inside her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir in her, a small flicker of hope. The city was colder that night, the kind of biting chill that gnawed at your bones and made even the most determined of hearts falter. Eleanor stayed huddled in her corner, the blanket wrapped tightly around her. The warmth from the woman's gift had lingered, a fleeting moment of tenderness in a life marked by sharp edges and isolation. But it wasn't enough to drive away the gnawing emptiness that settled deep inside her. Days passed, and each morning bled into the next. Eleanor still found herself at that same corner, though the daily routine felt somehow less hollow. She had started looking for the woman again, half hoping, half dreading that she might see her. A part of her wondered if it had all been a dream, an illusion born of hunger and desperation. But then, there she was again. The woman in the coat, with the same soft, steady expression. Eleanor's heart skipped. But this time, the woman didn't just look down at her. She paused, studying Eleanor carefully, as though trying to understand the depths of her silence. "I wasn't sure if you'd be here," she said, her voice warm, but with a thread of curiosity woven through it. Eleanor swallowed, unsure how to respond. She could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze on her, a quiet expectation. For a moment, the words lodged in her throat. Why would she care? She felt a surge of frustration at herself for allowing this to happen. Frustration at the woman for seeing her, really seeing her, when all she wanted was to hide. But then, there was the brief flash of compassion in the woman's eyes. Maybe she's just being kind, Eleanor reminded herself. She doesn't know me. She doesn't know who I really am. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I've been waiting," she said quietly, the words almost feeling like a confession. The woman smiled, but there was a sadness behind it now, as though she knew the weight of that statement. It's easy to wait, isn't it? Sometimes, all we can do is wait for something to change. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She wanted to argue, to say that waiting was futile, that she was stuck in this life she had chosen. She wanted to tell the woman that nothing would ever change. But she couldn't. Not with the kindness in her eyes, not with the blanket still warm across her shoulders. The woman nodded, as if understanding Eleanor's unspoken thoughts. Then, after a long pause, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small packet of tissues, holding it out to Eleanor. "For your nose," she said with a half smile. It was a simple gesture, one that should have been nothing more than a small kindness. Yet for Eleanor, it felt monumental. Her hands were trembling as she took the tissues. A quiet, desperate feeling crept through her, a longing for something more than just food or a blanket. Could it really be this simple? She wondered. Could the pain of her past truly be healed by the gentleness of a stranger? Or was it just another fleeting moment of illusion, like everything else in her broken world? The woman looked down at the street for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "You don't have to stay here, you know," she said gently. "I'm not saying it's easy, but you can leave. You don't have to live like this forever." Eleanor stiffened at the words. The idea of leaving the streets, of returning to the life she had abandoned, felt impossible. She hadn't wanted to leave, she'd needed to. There had been no other option, or so she had convinced herself. But hearing the words from someone else made it feel real, made her wonder if she could ever face the life she had run from. "I don't think I could," she whispered, almost to herself. Her heart ached and her chest tightened as memories of her husband, Alexander, came crashing back. "Could I really go back?" The woman studied her for a moment before speaking again, her voice softer now. "You deserve more than this. You don't have to hide forever." Eleanor's throat burned. She wanted to say something in return, something that would make sense of the storm in her chest. But all that came out was a shaky breath. The woman gave her a long, searching look, then stepped back. "I hope you'll find what you're looking for," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. "You don't have to be invisible." Eleanor nodded, but she didn't know what else to say. The woman turned to leave, her figure quickly swallowed by the crowd, but Eleanor stayed where she was, watching her go. Something about her words lingered in the air like an echo. Something inside Eleanor shifted, just a little. For the first time in years, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could change. Her hands clenched around the blanket, and she looked down at the sandwich the woman had given her, untouched. It had been more than food. It had been a lifeline, a small gesture that reminded her she wasn't completely lost. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to stay that way forever. The days following the encounter felt like a strange blur, as if the very air around Eleanor had shifted. Her corner, her spot on the street, no longer felt like an impenetrable prison. There was a flicker, faint and fragile, of something she had long buried deep inside, a quiet yearning to escape the shadows. Yet, every time she allowed herself to entertain the thought of leaving, the weight of guilt would drag her back, anchoring her to the streets. "You don't deserve anything better," the voice in her head would whisper. But the woman, that kind stranger, kept lingering in her mind. Her words about not being invisible echoed every time Eleanor closed her eyes. Could she really change? Could she step back into a world she'd left behind? A world that might no longer want her? The question hovered like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. Eleanor began to visit the street corner every day at the same time, hoping, needing, to see that woman again. It was a small ritual, something to hold onto in a life that had nothing else to cling to. Each time she returned to the corner, there was a twinge of hope in her chest, yet the woman never came back. It became a frustrating game of chance. Wait and wonder, but never know. Her thoughts were tangled with the uncertainty of whether or not the woman would appear. But as the days wore on, it became clear that no matter how many times she returned, the woman wasn't coming back. It was almost like the universe was playing tricks on her, showing her just enough of what might be, only to pull it away again. Yet, something in Eleanor began to change. She found herself walking with a little more purpose, holding herself a little higher than before. She started talking to a few of the other homeless souls she saw every day. Small exchanges at first, offering food or asking about the weather. The act of speaking felt strange, like a foreign language she had forgotten how to speak. But little by little, the silence that had been her constant companion began to crack open. One morning, she found herself standing in front of a small coffee cart, the smell of fresh brew hanging in the air. The vendor, an older man with kind eyes, smiled at her as she approached. "You look like you could use a cup of coffee," he said, as if he had seen her there for years, though it had only been a handful of days. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She didn't have any money, but she also didn't want to ask for charity. She had become so used to the walls she'd built around herself that it felt uncomfortable to accept anything. But the man, sensing her hesitation, simply poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her without another word. "On the house," he said, his voice warm but steady, like he knew her story even if she didn't. She accepted it with a quiet nod, unable to find the right words. She had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with dignity, to be seen as more than just a beggar. There, for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt like a person again. Not someone broken, not someone invisible, but someone deserving of kindness. Sipping the coffee, Eleanor felt the warmth spread through her, but not just physically. There was something deeper, something more profound, stirring inside her. The world felt a little less harsh in that moment, a little more bearable. The stranger's kindness, the vendor's quiet generosity, it wasn't just about the coffee. It was about something bigger. It was about seeing her. She stood there for a moment longer than she'd planned, just breathing in the warmth, letting the bitter taste of the coffee settle into her soul. Maybe she was starting to see herself, too. Maybe this was the first step toward breaking free from the cage of guilt and grief she had built around herself. As the vendor waved her off with a gentle smile, Eleanor walked away, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew that, for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint stirrings of something more, of possibility, of a chance to reclaim the pieces of herself that had been buried for too long. And maybe, just maybe, there was still time to find a way out of the darkness. The days grew colder, but Eleanor didn't mind as much anymore. Each step felt like a small victory, even if she didn't know where it would lead. The world still seemed so much bigger than she could ever hope to fit into, but there was something different now, something that made her chest feel less heavy. The act of talking to the coffee vendor, even if it had been brief, had stirred something in her. It made her realize how isolated she had been, even before the accident. How, in the midst of all her wealth, she had still been alone in her own way. But the real change came when she encountered the woman again. The same woman who had offered her the blanket, The same one who had spoken to her like she was more than just a nameless face in a sea of bodies. Eleanor had been waiting, as she always did, on the street corner. She didn't expect it, but she felt it before she saw her. There was a pull, an invisible thread drawing her attention. And there she was. The woman stopped in front of Eleanor, this time standing a little taller, her face soft with something unspoken. The same warmth from before lingered in her eyes, but there was something new, something different in her demeanor that Eleanor couldn't place. The woman held a small folder in her hands, looking down at Eleanor with an unreadable expression. "I didn't expect to find you here again," the woman said quietly, "but I'm glad I did." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. She wanted to say something that would make it easier, something that didn't feel so raw. But it was like the woman could see right through her and her words caught in her throat. The woman didn't wait for her to speak. She simply sat down beside Eleanor, pulling a chair from a nearby cafe, her presence almost protective. "I know you've been through a lot," she said softly, her voice as steady as ever. "And I'm sorry for that. I know you probably don't want to hear it, but I think it's time you hear the truth about who you really are." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The truth? Her stomach tightened as she tried to hide the panic that was rising in her. Her mind raced, thinking of everything she had run from, the world that had once been her own, and the man she had once loved. She looked at the woman, but couldn't find the courage to say anything. "I know who you are," the woman continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "You're Eleanor Hargrave. You're not just some homeless woman. You're the wife of a billionaire." Eleanor froze, the words like ice in her veins. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the distant hum of the city around them. It felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, like the entire foundation of her existence was crumbling away. The woman wasn't looking at her with pity. She wasn't offering her anything but the truth, a truth that Eleanor had buried for so long. And yet, there was no judgment in the woman's eyes, only a quiet understanding. You know who I am," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I recognize the ring," the woman said simply, her gaze falling to the diamond that still clung to Eleanor's finger. "The one you've been wearing since the accident. It's unmistakable. I'm part of a charity that works with the upper class. I knew who you were the moment I saw you." Eleanor's hands shook, and she could feel the color draining from her face. Her heart raced in her chest, each beat pounding louder than the last. She had thought she was invisible, had tried to become invisible. But here, in front of her, was someone who had seen her for who she really was. "I didn't," she trailed off, unsure how to explain herself. "I didn't want to be found. I thought if I just disappeared, her words faltered, lost in the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The woman leaned in slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to disappear anymore. You don't have to hide who you are." Eleanor's chest tightened, the weight of her guilt threatening to crush her. How could she possibly face that world again? The life she had left behind, the man she had loved, everything that had come crashing down in an instant. It felt like a different person's life, a life she no longer fit into. "I can't go back," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to the woman. "I don't belong there anymore." The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply sat there, waiting for Eleanor to find her words. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "You don't have to go back if you don't want to, but don't let the past define you forever. You can move forward, Eleanor. You can start again." The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt something inside her crack open. The guilt, the shame, the grief, they all pressed in on her, demanding to be acknowledged. But for the first time, she felt like she could breathe. Her hands were still trembling, but she slowly looked up at the woman. There was something in her eyes now, something she hadn't expected to see, a faint glimmer of hope. She didn't know if she was ready to take the leap. She didn't know if she ever would be. But for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt the tiniest spark of something she hadn't dared believe in. Maybe it's not too late to begin again. The days that followed the conversation with the woman were a blur, as though time had lost its rhythm. Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said. "You don't have to disappear anymore." Every word rang in her ears, echoing through the silence of her small corner on the streets. She had been hiding for so long, burying herself under the weight of guilt and shame, thinking that if she stayed invisible, the past would stay hidden, too. But now that illusion was shattered. The woman had been kind. She had offered her warmth and understanding, but her words had cracked open something deeper inside Eleanor. She couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't live in the shadows, pretending to be someone she wasn't. But the thought of returning to the life she had walked away from was terrifying. The mansion, the charity galas, the luxury, the image of a perfect, seamless life that had all come crashing down in an instant. And then there was Alexander. The memory of him, his face, his laugh, still haunted her. The guilt of surviving when he hadn't, of abandoning him after the crash. She could never bring herself to face that again. How could she return to a world where she had failed so spectacularly? The thought of returning to that gilded cage felt suffocating, like a trap she could never escape. But still, the woman's words lingered. You don't have to hide who you are. The quiet truth in them, the way they had pierced through her layers of anger and shame, it felt like a lifeline. She didn't know if she was ready, but she couldn't stay in the darkness forever. Could she? One afternoon, the decision came suddenly. Eleanor was sitting on the same street corner, her fingers wrapped around the warm cup of coffee from the vendor, when she noticed a familiar face among the crowd. The woman. She was walking toward her, purposeful and steady. This time, she wasn't alone. She had a man with her, tall, in a suit, looking out of place in the rough streets. But it was the way they moved together, side by side, that made Eleanor's stomach twist. The woman stopped in front of Eleanor and gave a small, reassuring smile. I didn't expect to see you here today, she said, her voice gentle. I've been hoping you'd think about my offer. Eleanor's heart raced. The offer. She hadn't wanted to think about it, about returning to the life she had abandoned, about facing the people who had once called her their queen. But now the woman was standing before her, holding out an olive branch, and it was too late to run. The man with her, noticing the tension in Eleanor's face, took a step back, as if sensing that this was a conversation for only the two women. The woman smiled at him before turning back to Eleanor. You don't have to make a decision today, but I want you to know there's a place for you if you want it. Eleanor swallowed, the words heavy in her mouth. What do you mean? What place? The life you walked away from, the woman said softly. You don't have to go back to all of it, but there's still room for you. The foundation, the charity work, Alexander's legacy. It could be yours if you wanted it. You don't have to hide anymore. You could rebuild. Eleanor looked at her, stunned. The offer was more than just an escape. It was a chance to rebuild, to find purpose again, to step back into the life she had once taken for granted. But the thought of returning to that world felt suffocating, like she would be betraying everything she had worked to leave behind. Could she really go back to that life? She closed her eyes, her chest tight. The woman's words had awakened a part of her she had long buried. A part that wanted to belong again, that wanted to feel like she mattered, not as a widow, not as a ghost, but as herself. But the cost of that, the price of her own forgiveness, seemed too steep. I don't know if I can, Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to the woman. The woman gave her a soft, understanding smile. You don't have to decide right now. But know this, the choice is yours. You are not defined by your past, Eleanor. You never have been. Eleanor looked up at her, a pang of longing in her chest. Could she let go of the guilt? Could she truly move forward, not as the wife of a billionaire, but as a woman finding her own way? The woman's words rang in her ears. You don't have to hide anymore. Eleanor felt the weight of those words, heavy but not oppressive. She could feel the possibility blooming within her, fragile yet real. She wasn't ready to make a decision today, but she had finally admitted something to herself. She was ready to face the future. I'll think about it, she said quietly, her voice trembling but resolute. The woman nodded, a warmth in her gaze. Take all the time you need. But remember, you're not alone in this. Not anymore. As the woman walked away, Eleanor felt something inside her shift, something she hadn't known she was waiting for. She wasn't sure where her path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of hope. Maybe there was a way forward. Maybe she could finally forgive herself. Eleanor woke up the next morning to the soft hum of the city, the sun peeking through the thin layer of clouds. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual rush of traffic subdued by the overcast sky. The weight of the previous day's conversation still pressed on her chest, but it felt different today. Lighter, somehow. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the woman had looked at her, not with pity or sympathy, but with understanding. Like she could see the person Eleanor had been before all of this, before the crash, before the loss, before the pain. Maybe it was the possibility of something more, something she hadn't dared to believe in for so long. But even now, as she sat at the same corner she had visited for days, the decision still felt far too big. Could she really step back into that life? The life she had abandoned so willingly, so desperately? The life that had consumed her in its own way. She looked down at the diamond ring she still wore. It had once been a symbol of everything good in her life. Her marriage to Alexander, their future, their dreams. Now it felt like a shackle, a reminder of everything she couldn't fix, everything she had lost. But it was just a ring, and that was just the past, wasn't it? Eleanor watched the world go by, the crowds of people lost in their own lives, their own struggles, their own ambitions. She had been part of that world once. She had been somebody important, somebody loved. She had a purpose, but now, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up, half expecting to see the woman again. But it wasn't her. It was a young man, maybe in his late 20s, with a friendly smile and a gentle wave. "Hey," he said, his voice warm. "You doing okay? You need anything?" Eleanor blinked, unsure how to react. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to her, but the genuine concern in his eyes caught her off guard. It was different this time. This wasn't just a passerby dropping a coin into her cup. This wasn't someone just moving along with their day, indifferent to the person they passed. This was a connection, even if fleeting. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. He smiled again, pausing in front of her. "I get it. You know, I was homeless once too. It's tough, but it doesn't define you. You can get out of this. You just have to keep going." Eleanor's chest tightened, her throat suddenly thick with emotion. "It doesn't define you." The words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like they might be true. She wasn't defined by the streets, or by the loss, or by the woman she had been. She could change. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The young man nodded, still smiling, and then, as easily as he had come, he was gone, just another face in the crowd, another fleeting moment of kindness. But it had been enough, more than enough. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor didn't feel so invisible. She sat there for a long while, watching the world pass by, her hands folded in her lap. Her mind replayed the conversation with the woman. The offer, the possibility of returning to her old life. She didn't know if she was ready for that. She didn't know if she ever would be. But she could start again. She could heal. For the first time in years, Eleanor realized that she had a choice. She wasn't stuck. She wasn't condemned to live in the shadows forever. She could walk away from the past. She could rebuild, piece by piece, her own way. The sun broke through the clouds just then, casting a soft light on the street. Eleanor stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no grand revelation, no moment of dramatic clarity, but in that quiet moment, she felt something shift within her. A quiet resolve, a flicker of hope. She wasn't the wife of a billionaire anymore. She wasn't the woman she had been before the crash, but she was still her. And that, she realized, was enough. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned away from the corner, stepping out into the street with a new sense of purpose. The road ahead wasn't clear, and it certainly wasn't easy. But for the first time, she was ready to walk it. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew she was no longer invisible. And that was enough to start.